Pick that up, sweetheart." That's what Dr. Sterling said to the overnight nurse at Mercy General in Raleigh, the one nobody knew anything about. The one with surgical steel composure and hands that moved like they'd been forged in something harder than a civilian nursing degree. They didn't know she'd stitched arterial bleeds while mortars fell. They didn't know she'd held dying Marines' hands in Baghdad while her own hands stayed steady. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It ended careers. But first, she had to survive 3 days of hell from a man who'd never faced a real emergency in his entire privileged life. Sarah Chen arrived at Mercy General at 8:47 p.m., sliding into the night shift like water, no fanfare, no announcement, just presence. The November rain hammered the parking lot behind her as she moved through the sliding doors, her scrub still carrying that sharp antiseptic smell that triggered muscle memory she'd spent for years trying to suppress. 13 years. That's how long she'd been gone from the Navy. 13 years of civilian life, of choosing a quiet corner hospital in Raleigh over the constant edge of deployment, of telling her daughter that mom had always just been a nurse and nothing more complicated than that. The lie had become easier with time, the way lies do when you repeat them enough. The fluorescent lights above the nurse's station cast that particular sick white glow that made everything look like a photograph from a decade ago. She clocked in at 8:53, her badge, the temporary one, still marked new hire, clipping against her sternum with a quiet metallic whisper. 3 weeks in. 3 weeks of orienting on the night shift, and nobody had asked about the scars on her forearms that she kept covered with long sleeves even when the ward ran hot enough to cook in. Nobody had asked about the way she moved, economical, precise, every gesture stripped down to its essential function. Nobody had asked about anything, really. That was the point. That was the entire architecture of her reinvention. The night shift stretched ahead of her, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., the graveyard hours when acuity spiked and staffing dropped and the real work happened in silence. She'd chosen this deliberately. Night shifts meant fewer administrators walking rounds, fewer doctors lingering to supervise, fewer eyes asking questions. It meant she could exist as a competent body moving through a hospital, changing dressings and running labs and checking vitals, without anyone needing to know the history written in the muscle memory of her hands. That was the plan. That was the entire reason she'd landed here instead of at some prestigious trauma center where her military background might have been a conversation starter instead of a classified footnote. Room 347 was her first patient of the evening. Rodriguez. Disabled Marine in his early 40s, admitted 3 days ago with a complicated wound infection that hadn't responded well to outpatient antibiotics. His chart noted him as uncooperative, resistant to pain management, preferred to keep the room lights dim. Sarah read the subtext, a guy who'd been ground up by the military machine and spat out into a civilian healthcare system that had no context for what he carried. She recognized that subtext because she lived inside it. The door to his room was partially closed. She knocked, waited 2 seconds, and pushed it open to a darkness relieved only by the monitor's soft blue glow and the ambient light bleeding in from the hallway. Rodriguez lay in the bed with his eyes toward the window, his right leg elevated with a wound site visible beneath the current dressing, a clean surgical site, but the surrounding tissue showed the kind of inflammation that suggested infection was still winning. His jacket hung on the chair beside the bed, and pinned to the interior lining was a unit patch, faded to the color of old coffee, sewn there with stitches that had been done by steady hands a long time ago. Sarah saw it the way you see the face of someone from your past in a crowd of strangers, a moment of recognition so complete it almost knocked her breath out of her. "Good evening, Rodriguez." Her voice came out the way she'd trained it to come out, neutral, professional, nothing underneath it but competence. "I'm Sarah. I'll be your nurse tonight. I need to check your wound dressing and get current vitals if that works for you." Rodriguez didn't turn his head. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the window. "Fine." She moved to the bedside, her shoes making no sound on the linoleum because she'd learned decades ago how to walk in a way that announced her presence without aggressive intention. Her hands began the routine. Gloves snapped, a sound like a quiet whip crack. The old dressing came away carefully, revealing the surgical site underneath, the skin around it angry red and warm to the touch. Normal, given the timeline. She'd seen far worse. She'd treated far worse with equipment that was basically held together with prayers and whatever sutures she could scavenge from supply tents that didn't officially exist. Her hands moved through the procedure with the kind of precision that comes from having done it hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Clean, dry, apply the antibiotic ointment in a thin even layer, new dressing secured at all four corners, the kind of flawless dressing work that you don't learn in nursing school because nursing school doesn't teach you how to operate when the power's out and the temperature is 42 degrees Celsius and someone's breathing is getting shallower by the minute. The muscle memory took over completely. Her hands knew what to do. Her mind drifted somewhere calm and separate. That stitch pattern. Rodriguez's voice came quiet, almost to himself. I know that stitch pattern. Sarah didn't pause. She continued securing the dressing, her movements unchanged. Just trying to keep it clean and protected. No. His head turned now, his eyes finding hers in the darkness. They were eyes that had seen things, that had watched other people's lives leak out of them in bad places with worse lighting than this hospital room. That's not a civilian stitch. That's a corpsman's knot. That's Baghdad, 2007. He stopped. His breathing changed, became shallower. Realization moved across his face like weather. Sarah placed one finger to her lips, slow and deliberate. A request. A plea for silence encoded in one gesture. She held his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then looked back to the monitor where his vitals were climbing toward somewhere less stable. Her hands continued their work, finishing the dressing, documenting the observations in his chart, moving through the rest of the room's routine with the same efficient silence she'd wrapped around herself like armor for 13 years. Some bonds, she understood, transcended whatever identity you decided to wear next. Some recognition went deeper than names or credentials or the comfortable fiction you built to survive. She was documenting vitals when the elevator dinged down the hallway. The sound drifted through the door, not urgent, just the ambient noise of the hospital continuing its 24-hour breathing. But the footsteps that followed were different. Expensive shoes. The kind that cost more than her monthly car payment. The kind that announced arrival and expected space to clear accordingly. Sarah didn't look up from the monitor, but every muscle in her body registered the shift in air pressure that meant someone important had entered her space. You're the new overnight. Dr. Sterling. Not a question. A statement delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested he knew exactly who everyone was, why they were here, and how competent or incompetent they'd proved to be within the first week. He was tall, probably mid-50s, with the kind of jawline that had never developed softness from doubt and the kind of eyes that looked at people and automatically calculated their utility. His tie was silk. His watch was the kind of thing that made its own gravity in a room. Sarah looked up, her expression neutral as still water. Dr. Sterling. Room 347. Recent infection showing signs of improvement but still elevated inflammatory markers. Vital stable, pain management accepted without resistance. I see. His gaze moved across her the way a security camera moves across an empty parking lot, present but not really seeing anything. You're from? Night shift rotation. 3 weeks in. Before that. She hesitated for maybe half a second too long. Travel nursing. Several years. It wasn't technically a lie. She'd traveled extensively. The fact that the travel had been military deployment structured was a detail that didn't belong in this conversation. She kept her voice deferential, the way good night shift nurses did when they spoke to doctors who could make their lives infinitely more difficult if the mood struck them. Apologetic. Grateful for the opportunity to exist in his presence. Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't involve warmth, just the architectural knowledge of how to arrange his face so that it looked like a smile. Well, welcome to Mercy General. You should know that night shift can be quite a shock to experienced nurses. For new ones. He paused. Let the implications sit there. We generally see turnover within a week. Sometimes less. I have a standing bet with the residents, $500 says you'll quit before next Friday. You want to take that bet? The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze from the room next door. Sarah met his eyes. Her voice came out steady as surgical steel. "No, doctor. I'm staying." Confidence. He laughed, a sound like gravel in a disposal. "I like that. You'll need it." He turned, his shoes clicking against the tile in that expensive way, and moved toward Rodriguez's room without waiting for any response. His presence was the kind that commanded compliance through sheer institutional weight, the kind that came from knowing he had allies in every corner of this building. The kind that had never been seriously challenged by anyone in a position where they needed to work the next shift. Sarah stood very still at the nurse's station, her hands flat against the desk surface. The ticking of the wall clock moved toward 9 p.m. 36 hours until he decided to escalate. 36 hours until the real pressure began. She knew this dance. She'd danced it in different uniforms, different countries, with different men holding different kinds of authority. The choreography never changed. Only the consequences did. She returned to her charting. Around her, the hospital moved through its nocturnal rhythm, monitors beeping in patterns, the occasional call light, the fluorescent hum that sounded like electricity burning. In room 347, Rodriguez lay in his darkened space with the knowledge that his nurse carried history written in her hands. And on the administrative floors above, Dr. Sterling had already mentally checked off another incompetent temporary worker who'd be gone by morning. None of them had any idea what was about to unfold over the next 72 hours. The doctor's lounge at Mercy General sat behind a half-closed door at 2 in the morning, and Dr. Sterling's voice carried through the gap like a knife drawn slow from a sheath. Sarah moved past with her medication cart, the bottles clinking softly against their slots, but Sterling's words found her anyway. "The night shift nurse," he announced to the 3 residents gathered around the coffee station, his tone the particular brightness of a predator sizing prey. "I give her a week before she quits. Anyone want that bet?" Laughter followed, the nervous kind that comes when subordinates aren't sure if disagreement is allowed. Sterling settled back into his chair, cradling black coffee like a trophy. These overnight people, they're not real clinicians. They're babysitters with licenses. No spine. No stamina. Sarah's jaw tightened. Her hands remained steady on the cart, but the fluorescent lights above hummed a little louder in the sudden pressure of the moment. She kept walking. The chart in her hand didn't shake. The residents' eyes followed her down the hallway, but none of them met her gaze. 2 nights later, the cafeteria at 3 in the morning was nearly empty, just Sarah gathering her first real break in 12 hours. The night shift at Mercy General operated on the margins of institutional time, where the day staff had gone home and the emergency department hadn't yet exploded into crisis. She carried her tray toward a corner table, soup steaming in its paper cup, crackers wrapped in plastic. That was when Sterling appeared, moving with the casual precision of someone following a planned trajectory rather than chance. He was close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore, something that cost more than her shift differential. The collision felt deliberate. His shoulder found her tray with the kind of physics that suggested calculation. The soup launched, arced through fluorescent light, and crashed to the tile floor in a bloom of red liquid that looked far too much like something else. The impact echoed. 3 nurses at the far table froze. A janitor looked up from wiping the service counter. Sterling smiled. The smile was the worst part, not angry, not even contemptuous, but satisfied in the way of someone watching a plan execute exactly as designed. He pulled a patient chart from under his arm, the manila folder worn at the edges, and dropped it deliberately at Sarah's feet. Not handed. Dropped. The chart skidded across the wet floor, stopping against the toe of her shoe. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched for the room, for the witnesses. "And maybe review Rodriguez's case while you're down there. I noticed some questionable documentation in your notes." His eyes held hers for 2 seconds too long. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing off tile like a punctuation mark. Sarah took one measured breath. Her hands were already moving, already kneeling to gather the scattered documents, the chart, fragments of soggy crackers from the tile. A single tear escaped her left eye, not a sob, not trembling, just one crystalline drop that traced the line of her cheekbone like evidence. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with the chart, her voice emerging steady as surgical steel, each word distinct and separated like doses of a drug administered with precision. "I've cleaned up worse messes than you'll ever make, Doctor." The cafeteria went absolutely silent. Even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. Sterling stopped walking. His shoulders tensed visibly, his hand finding the doorframe. The color rose in his face like a tide he couldn't control, the particular red that comes when someone has been seen, truly seen, and found wanting. He didn't turn around. Couldn't turn around. Instead, his jaw worked silently for 2 seconds before he pushed through the exit doors into the hallway beyond. A janitor materialized beside Sarah with a mop bucket and began cleaning the spill without speaking. Sarah gathered the chart, organized the scattered papers with those same precise movements she'd been trained to use in combat hospitals where steady hands meant the difference between someone going home and someone going to Arlington. The notebook pages had absorbed soup, making some medication notations illegible. She'd have to rewrite her documentation. That would take time she didn't have. Sterling would notice, would probably use it as evidence of her incompetence. The janitor, Marcus, his name tag read, though she'd never asked, handed her paper towels. "Some people can't handle being proven wrong," he said quietly. "They get dangerous." Sarah nodded. She had seen that before. She had seen what happened when men with authority realized that authority wasn't the same thing as competence. The third instance came during morning handoff in the hallway outside the ICU, where Sarah was supposed to brief the day shift charge nurse on overnight admissions and status changes. Sterling intercepted the conversation by positioning himself between Sarah and the receiving nurse, a woman named Harris who had worked Mercy General's day shift for 17 years and knew better than to get caught between a territorial doctor and anyone he'd decided to dominate. Before Nurse Chen gives her summary, Sterling said, his voice carrying that public brightness again, the tone that made everything sound like concern, "I want everyone aware that I've documented several protocol concerns." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, she hadn't seen him make any notes, and flipped it open with theatrical precision. "Chen seems to think overnight staff can practice medicine. Yesterday, she questioned my order for my Dazalam on a patient who was already sedated. Today, she suggested that a warfarin interaction wasn't clinically significant." He closed the notebook with a snap. "That's not nursing. That's practicing outside her scope." The hallway had grown crowded. 2 residents had stopped. A pharmacy technician pushing a med cart had slowed her pace. Everyone was listening. Everyone was watching. Sarah understood the mathematics of public humiliation. The audience mattered more than the words. The audience was the weapon. Sterling turned to her now, and his smile was predatory in the way of something that had already decided how this would end. "You're here to follow orders, not question them. Understand, sweetheart." The word sweetheart had become a weapon itself, deployed twice now, calibrated to sting. Sarah's grip on her clipboard tightened. The plastic edge bent slightly under pressure. Her jaw clenched so hard she could feel her teeth pressing together. She nodded once, just once, and said nothing. The silence that followed was the sound of choice being made. The silence was the sound of her understanding, finally and completely, that Dr. Sterling had decided she was the problem. That he had decided she needed to be removed. Harris stepped forward, awkward and uncomfortable, trying to salvage something from the conversation. "I'll take report," she said to Sarah. "Room by room, okay?" But Sterling was already walking away, his presence still echoing in the hallway like a stain. Sarah followed Harris, her eyes forward, her hand steady even though her heart was moving at a pace that would have triggered every monitor on the cardiac floor. 3 residents continued their rounds. The pharmacy technician resumed her delivery. The hallway normalized. But something had shifted in the institutional structure of Mercy General. Something had crystallized. Dr. Sterling had drawn a line, and Sarah had not stepped back from it. That was the moment he had moved from contempt to something far more dangerous, the recognition that she represented a threat to the careful hierarchy that kept him elevated. The moment he understood, with absolute certainty, that she would have to be destroyed. That night, the third night of Sarah's tenure at Mercy General, Rodriguez was sleeping in room 347 when she arrived for his wound care. The disabled Marine veteran lay on his back, his amputation site wrapped in surgical dressing from a recent revision procedure designed to improve his prosthetic fit. The pain management protocol Sterling had ordered was barely adequate, but that wasn't Sarah's call to make. Not yet. Not while Sterling was watching. She moved through the room with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, in field hospitals and surgical tents, in trauma bays and quiet recovery wards. Prep, clean, assess, stitch check. Her hands moved with that particular precision that comes from training at the highest levels, from having had to work fast and perfectly because the alternative was someone's daughter or son not coming home. The dressing she applied followed a specific pattern: 3 horizontal strips, 2 vertical, 1 diagonal stabilizer that distributed load pressure across the amputation site without compromising circulation. It was a technique taught in Navy combat medic courses. It was distinctly military. It was, in that moment, a mistake. Rodriguez's breathing changed. His eyes, which had been mostly closed in pain and fatigue, opened and tracked her movements with sudden focus. When she completed the diagonal stabilizer, his voice emerged hoarse and careful, like someone speaking a language they hadn't used in years. Baghdad, 2007. Sarah's hands froze. She didn't speak. She didn't look at him. She simply held her position, her fingers still touching the securing tape, her entire body gone very still. That's a common stitch pattern, Rodriguez continued quietly. Field stabilization technique. I was a combat medic, different unit, but I saw it every day. Saw it save lives. Sarah's face had gone pale. The room seemed to have developed a pressure all its own, a weight that pressed down from the fluorescent lights above. She glanced at the door. No one was in the hallway. No one had seen. Rodriguez waited, his veteran's patience filling the silence. "Please," Sarah said quietly. "I need you to not understand." Rodriguez finished. His eyes held compassion that cut deeper than judgment ever could. "I recognize more than your hands. I know what someone looks like when they're trying to forget." Sarah placed a finger to her lips, a gesture of supplication and plea. Rodriguez nodded slowly, understanding the architecture of her silence, the weight of whatever she was carrying. She finished the dressing in absolute silence, her movements becoming mechanical, her breathing controlled through sheer force of discipline. As she turned toward the door, Rodriguez called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Senior Chief." Sarah's entire body stopped. She didn't turn around. The rank hung in the air between them like recognition, like the moment when two soldiers realize they speak the same language. "Thank you," Rodriguez said. "For whatever you're running from, I hope you find peace." Sarah's hand trembled on the door frame, the first crack in her composure, visible only in that tiny, involuntary gesture. She stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her with careful softness. Down the corridor, outside the nurse's station, Dr. Sterling stood with his arms crossed over his chest, watching her emerge from Rodriguez's room. Their eyes met for 1 second, 2 seconds, long enough for Sarah to understand that he had seen them talking, had seen something pass between them. His expression shifted, and she watched something dangerous crystallize in his features, the realization that there was a connection he didn't understand, a secret, a depth to her that he had not yet excavated. His mind was working. Planning. She could see it happening in real time, the calculations beginning, the decision forming. Whatever he was going to do next, it would be more than public humiliation. It would be strategic. It would be designed to isolate her completely. He smiled at her from across the distance, a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. The monitor screamed. 3 a.m. on day 3, and Rodriguez's oxygen saturation plummeted like a stone dropped into dark water. 88. 82. 76. The ventilator hissed its mechanical protest, but something was catastrophically wrong inside his chest cavity. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped between lung and chest wall, compressing the heart with every breath, slowly suffocating him from the inside. Dr. Sterling stood at the bedside, his surgeon's hand suddenly foreign to him. The chest tube kit sat open on the sterile field, instruments laid out in precise rows like surgical chess pieces. He reached for the 14-gauge needle. His fingers trembled. Once. Barely perceptible. But Sarah saw it from the doorway where she'd been charting, and in that tremor she recognized something she'd seen before in Baghdad when young medics froze under fire, the absolute paralysis of a man whose confidence had never been tested by genuine crisis. Sterling's voice came out clipped, authoritative. "I've got this. Resident, get me the local anesthetic. Now." But his hands didn't move. The needle sat on the tray. His eyes fixed on Rodriguez's chest, calculating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact location where the needle had to pierce to decompress the trapped air, and he couldn't seem to translate knowledge into action. 70. 68. The young resident, a fourth-year named Chen, no relation to Sarah, stood frozen beside him, watching their attending physician decompose in real time. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical rhythm like a metronome counting down to death. Rodriguez's blood pressure flickered across the monitor. 104/60. 102/58. The trajectory was unmistakable. 3 minutes. Maybe 4 before cardiac arrest. Sarah moved. There was no decision to make, no internal debate about protocol or hierarchy or the consequences of stepping into Sterling's space. Pain is data. Crisis is clarity. She crossed the room in 4 strides, her hands already reaching for fresh gloves, her mind already 3 steps ahead of Sterling's paralysis. Her voice came out low and even, the way it had in field hospitals when rounds of incoming fire meant you had seconds to triage and decide who lived. "Step back, doctor." It wasn't phrased as a request. The inflection was wrong for supplication. Sterling turned, his face flushing with a mixture of humiliation and rage, but something in her posture, the way her shoulders had squared, the way her eyes had hardened into something older than 32, made him step back. He didn't move far. Just enough to let her hand access the patient. She didn't look at Sterling. Rodriguez was her entire world now. She found the landmarks on his chest by feel, the same way she'd found them 1,000 times before on practice dummies and real human beings in places where the sound of the needle sliding home meant the difference between a soldier breathing and a soldier dying. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She prepped the skin with chlorhexidine in 3 sweeping motions, not rushing, not hesitating either. Muscle memory, yes, but something deeper too, the accumulated knowledge of a body that had trained for exactly this moment for 18 years. The needle went in. There was a specific sensation when it hit the parietal pleura, a subtle change in resistance that most people never learn to recognize. Sarah felt it. Knew it. Her thumb depressed the plunger on the angiocath, and the trapped air hissed out with an almost audible sigh of release. The sound was like opening a door that had been sealed too long. 02 sat climbing. 74. 81. 92. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor now, the rhythm recovering as the pressure released from around Rodriguez's heart. Blood pressure stabilizing. 106/60. 110/64. The young resident, Chen, stared at what he'd just witnessed. Not a doctor performing a procedure. A concert violinist's hands. A neurosurgeon's precision. A combat medic's muscle memory executing the exact movement she'd performed hundreds of times on Marines who would have died otherwise. Sterling stood motionless, 3 feet away, watching her tape down the needle with the same efficiency she'd used to place it. His face had transformed into something harder to read. Not just humiliation now. Rage, yes. But underneath it, something that looked almost like fear, the fear of a man who'd just realized he wasn't the most skilled person in the room, and worse, that everyone knew it now. The resident knew it. The nurses who'd rushed in knew it. Rodriguez knew it, his eyes moving to find Sarah's face even through the sedation, some deep recognition passing between them. The cardiac monitor beeped its normal rhythm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical song. Rodriguez's oxygen saturation held steady at 95%. The crisis had lasted 90 seconds from code to stabilization. Sterling didn't speak. He left the room instead, his movements stiff, his jaw clenched so tightly you could see the muscle flex beneath his skin. Sarah watched him go. She didn't follow. She checked Rodriguez's line placement, ensured the taping would hold, and made notes in the chart with handwriting that was perfectly legible and perfectly impersonal. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part began 47 minutes later when Dr. Sterling sat in his office with the door closed and the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes secrets look even darker. He reached for his phone. 7 a.m. wasn't too early to call Richard Pemberton, the hospital board chair. Sterling knew Pemberton would be awake. Men like Pemberton were always awake, their minds running calculations even while they slept. The phone rang 3 times. Sterling could imagine him reaching across whatever expensive mattress he was lying on, fumbling for the handset with the irritation of a man whose sleep had been disturbed. Richard. Mark Sterling. I apologize for the hour, but we have a liability situation that needs immediate attention. Sterling's voice had transformed. No longer the hesitant surgeon from bedside. This was the voice of a man with institutional power, a man who'd made this call 100 times before, a man who knew exactly which levers to pull. The overnight nurse, Sarah Chen. I've documented concerning competence gaps and insubordination. Last night she overstepped her scope during a patient crisis, performed a procedure that should have been my call. When I tried to establish appropriate boundaries, she became confrontational. I'm requesting an immediate credentialing review. Pemberton's voice came back thick with sleep. Mark, HR can handle this Monday. Richard, with respect, I need this expedited. She has access to level 3 patients. If her credentials don't hold up under scrutiny, if there are gaps in her history, the hospital could face significant liability. Sterling let that last word hang. Liability. The word that opened every institutional door. I've already contacted Patricia Voss. She can do a full background review by end of business today. I'm requesting you authorize it. The line went quiet. Sterling could feel Pemberton calculating, weighing the cost of investigating against the cost of not investigating. In institutions like hospitals, the equation always favored caution. Fine, Pemberton said. But this better be legitimate, Mark. Not personal. It's entirely professional, Sterling said, and ended the call. He made the second call to the County Medical Licensing Board at 7:15. The clerk who answered was new, probably still fresh enough to be impressed by a doctor's voice. I'm verifying credentials for Sarah Chen, RN. License number, Sterling read the number from her application. Can you confirm her license status and any employment gaps? The clerk confirmed everything appeared current, properly renewed. Sterling pressed further. Military service on the employment history. Can you verify those dates? The clerk explained that the licensing board only verified current credentials, not employment history. Sterling thanked her and moved to the third call. Her professional references came back glowing. Too glowing, actually. When Sterling pressed them about gaps in her employment record, about any period she might not have been working, both calls ended quickly. One reference actually said, I can't discuss that, in a tone that suggested there were reasons she couldn't discuss it, and those reasons went significantly deeper than typical professional discretion. By 9 a.m., Sterling had made contact with Patricia Voss, a tall woman with grey at her temples who'd built a business specializing in what she called employment risk assessment, which meant she was very good at finding inconsistencies in resumes and histories, particularly among employees with something to hide. There's a 7-year gap, Voss reported back at 1:15 p.m., her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd uncovered exactly what her client wanted her to find. High school ends. Then nothing until she appears in nursing school records at 25. No tax records for those years. No employment history. No college records. It's like she simply didn't exist for 7 years. Sterling smiled. A smile that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with vindication. He drafted the formal complaint to HR by 2 p.m., insubordination, questionable credentials, inappropriate patient relationships, documented performance that exceeded her stated scope of practice, and what he carefully termed employment history inconsistencies that warrant immediate investigation. He sent it electronically with a request for urgent review. By 4 p.m., he'd been contacted by the HR director, a woman named Catherine Mills who'd learned in her 30 years of hospital administration that when a doctor submitted paperwork like this with specific language about liability, you took it seriously. "We'll need to suspend her pending investigation," Mills said over the phone. "Have her turn in her badge when she comes for the morning shift. I'll have security escort her to the office." "I think that's the appropriate precaution," Sterling said. The code alert sounded across the hospital at 11 p.m. that night, but Sarah Chen wasn't there to respond. She was already gone, her badge in an HR envelope, her future suspended in the same institutional amber that had trapped her 7-year history in silence. Dr. Sterling walked past the empty room where Rodriguez slept, alive because of hands he'd just removed from his hospital, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who understood that institutions protect their own, and that within those institutions, credentials were currency and silence was collateral. He had no idea that Rodriguez's eyes had opened while Sarah performed the needle decompression. That this Marine, this combat veteran who'd spent 3 years in Baghdad beside her, had seen the way she moved. That he'd felt the recognition settle into his chest like scar tissue. That he was already making phone calls of his own, calls that would reach up through chains of command that made hospital boards look like lemonade stands. Dr. Sterling stood in the physician's lounge at 2:47 in the morning, Rodriguez's monitor still beeping in his ears, his hands still trembling with rage. Not fear. Never fear. Rage. A night shift nurse, a nobody, had just performed a procedure that belonged in his hands, in front of his residence, with his patient. The humiliation was a living thing, writhing beneath his skin. He picked up his phone. Richard Pemberton answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. The hospital board chair didn't appreciate late-night calls, but Sterling had calculated the timing perfectly. Pemberton would be disoriented, defensive, eager to end the conversation. Vulnerable. "Richard, it's Mark Sterling. We have a situation at Mercy General that requires immediate board attention." Sterling's voice carried the weight of someone who'd already made decisions, not someone requesting permission. The night shift nurse, Sarah Chen, she's a significant liability. It's the middle of the night, Mark. This couldn't wait until. A resident witnessed direct insubordination tonight. Patient care protocol violation. She overstepped her scope during a critical code, contradicted my medical judgment in front of witnesses, and created a hostile environment that's affecting staff morale. Sterling let silence fill the line. Silence was his tool. Silence meant he was waiting for Pemberton to fill the void with agreement. What exactly happened? Rodriguez was coding. I was managing the case. She physically intervened without authorization, inserted a needle that I hadn't ordered, and essentially assaulted the patient. The word hung there like a blade. Assault. I documented it, but the residents are frightened. They're questioning whether night shift oversight is adequate. Pemberton was awake now. Sterling could hear the shift in his breathing. "You're suggesting she needs to be removed." "I'm suggesting she needs to be investigated before she injures someone." Her credentials came with a 7-year employment gap. Nobody's verified where she was or what she was actually doing. That's an HR liability, Richard. That's a lawsuit. The call ended with Pemberton agreeing to have someone look into it by morning. Sterling hung up and immediately dialed the reference number Sarah had provided on her employment application. A hospital in San Diego. A clinic in Seattle. He left messages at both, his tone one of concerned verification. Just doing our due diligence on a candidate. Any gaps in her employment history? Any concerns about clinical judgment? We need to hear about anything unusual. By 3:15 a.m., Sterling had contacted the hospital's outside HR investigator, a woman named Patricia Voss, who owed him a favor from his previous tenure. I need you to audit Sarah Chen's credentials file, he said. Tonight. Quietly. Look for inconsistencies, gaps, anything that suggests she's misrepresenting her qualifications. It's 3 in the morning, Mark. It's a personnel safety issue. Insubordination during a code. Patient endangerment. I need it documented before the day shift arrives. Voss understood the real message. She was to build a file, any file, that would justify suspension. Sterling had given her the blueprint, the employment gap was the lever. Everyone had something to hide. Sarah Chen would too. By 5 a.m., Sterling had received responses from both references. Neither had explicit records of Sarah's employment. The San Diego hospital had undergone a server migration 7 years ago. Records were incomplete. The Seattle clinic had closed. Both responses created the exact impression Sterling needed: shadowy, unverifiable, suspicious. When Voss arrived at 6:30 a.m., she had already prepared the suspension paperwork. 2 security officers stood ready at the nurse's station. Sterling positioned himself in the physician's corridor where he could watch. Where she could see him watching. Sarah was clocking out when they intercepted her, her exhaustion visible in the slump of her shoulders. 2 night codes. A difficult labor and delivery. 3 hours of charting. The kind of night that should have left her depleted. Instead, when the security officers approached, she straightened. Her hand had already reached for her badge. Sarah Chen. Voss's voice carried the false sympathy of institutional power. You're suspended effective immediately pending investigation. We'll need your badge and facility access. Sarah released her badge without a word. Her eyes didn't search for Sterling. They didn't search for anything. But he could see the moment her composure cost her something, a tightness in her jaw, a breath held too long. She'd been suspended. She'd been humiliated. She'd been removed. The day shift watched as she walked toward the exit, her scrubs still bearing the salt stains of last night's sweat. The morning sun hit her as she pushed through the automatic doors, light so bright it seemed to erase her. Sterling remained in the corridor, allowing himself a smile. A small one. The kind that belonged to someone who understood institutional mechanics, who knew how to activate chains that most people didn't even realize existed. 1 phone call to a board chair. 1 message to an investigator. 1 leveraged favor. Sarah's car was parked in the north lot, 3 rows from the entrance. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open for 20 minutes before her hands were steady enough to grip the steering wheel. The morning air smelled of asphalt and diesel exhaust, hospital smells leaching into the parking lot like a stain that wouldn't wash out. She'd been careful for 7 years. She'd been quiet. She'd been invisible. And it hadn't mattered. Competence was a threat. Excellence made people afraid. Fear made them dangerous. Her phone buzzed at 2 p.m. An unknown number. She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Her daughter Emma was home early from school. The guidance counselor had called about an anxiety attack during her 3rd period. Sarah had failed to respond to the call. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table in her scrubs, still unwashed from the night before, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Emma found her there. Her mother, the woman who moved through the world like nothing could touch her, was crying. Not soft crying. The kind of crying that came from somewhere deeper than tears, that came from the place where you store everything you've decided not to feel. Mom. Emma's voice cracked. Why are you home early? Sarah looked at her daughter and couldn't find words. The careful architecture of her civilian life, the quiet nurse, the single mother, the woman who'd built a new identity from ashes, was collapsing. Everything she'd buried was clawing its way back to the surface, and Emma was standing in the rubble, terrified and confused, asking questions that required answers Sarah wasn't permitted to give. What happened? Emma knelt beside her, reaching for her mother's hand. Mom, what happened? The rain started in late afternoon, coming hard and fast against the kitchen windows like something with intention. Thunder rolled across Raleigh, distant and gathering. Sarah sat motionless while her daughter moved around the kitchen, making tea, pulling out paper towels, the small rituals of someone trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed by love alone. Sarah's suspension letter had arrived by email at 4 p.m. The investigation would take up to 14 business days. She was not to enter the facility. Her medical license would remain active pending the outcome. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she could see coming. The way these things always went. You gave them a thread and they pulled until everything unraveled. Dr. Sterling had given them a thread. He'd given them a gap, an inconsistency, a moment of insubordination that would bloom into something larger the longer she was gone. The longer she was invisible. Invisibility had protected her for 7 years. Now it would destroy her. Emma fell asleep on the couch at 10 p.m., her body curled against the armrest, her phone dark on her chest. Sarah covered her with a blanket and returned to the kitchen table, to the cold coffee and the letter and the terrible quiet of a house that was supposed to be safe. She pulled out her laptop and started searching her email for something, anything, that would prove her identity. But she had no documents. No credentials. No paper trail that could survive scrutiny. She'd been so careful to leave nothing behind. At 11 p.m., her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Senior Chief Chen. A man's voice. Clipped. Military bearing, even through the phone. This is Captain James Halloway, Marine Corps Liaison to Naval Special Warfare Command. We need to talk about why the Pentagon just received a termination notice from your civilian employer. The world tilted. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the table. How did you? We have flags on all your civilian employment. If there's a problem, we need to know immediately. Are you compromised? Is your location secure? Sarah's voice, when it came, sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone she'd left behind in Baghdad. Someone she'd spent 7 years trying not to be. I'm secure. My location is secure. I was suspended. There was a patient I helped during an emergency code. A doctor, the attending, he made a complaint. Silence on the line. Then, what's the hospital's name? Mercy General. Raleigh, North Carolina. Doctor's name. Sterling. Dr. Mark Sterling. Another pause. She could hear him already making calculations, already setting wheels in motion. This was what happened when you were flagged at the Pentagon. This was what it meant to have been something, to have done things that governments wanted catalogued and monitored. Don't go back to that hospital. Don't contact anyone. We're sending someone tomorrow. Just stay where you are. The line went dead. Sarah sat in the kitchen with rain hammering the windows like a judgment and understood that Dr. Sterling had done something he hadn't intended. He'd pulled a thread that didn't lead to her unraveling of Sarah Chen, night nurse. He'd pulled a thread that led directly to the Pentagon. He'd tried to destroy someone he thought was defenseless, not realizing he was reaching toward a ghost that had armor he couldn't see. That afternoon, Emma found her mother at the kitchen table, and the confusion in her voice cut deeper than any insult Sterling had ever thrown. Mom, why are you home early? Sarah sat with her hands wrapped around cold coffee, watching the steam that wasn't there anymore, and she had no words. How do you tell a 16-year-old that the life she'd built, the careful anonymity, the quiet healing, the second chance at being nobody important, had just been erased? The PTSD that Sarah had spent 7 years managing through silence and structure and the precise routine of night shifts suddenly felt like it was clawing its way back to the surface. Baghdad lived in her hands, in the muscle memory of procedures, in the way certain sounds made her breathing change. She'd never told Emma. Never said the word combat or deployed or Bronze Star. She'd just been mom, tired mom, working late mom, the kind of mom who flinched at fireworks but never explained why. Emma waited. The house was so quiet you could hear the refrigerator's mechanical hum, that low electrical drone that sounds like anxiety-given sound. Sarah opened her mouth and closed it again. If she told the truth now, everything would change. Emma would look at her differently. Pity would mix with pride in a way that would fracture something essential. The peace they'd built together, the ordinary life with homework complaints and college talk and arguments about curfew, that was the armor Sarah had needed. Not military-grade protection. Just the simple disguise of being nobody remarkable. "I made a mistake," Sarah finally said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "At the hospital. A mistake that made things complicated." It wasn't a lie. It was the smallest version of the truth, and it was all she could offer right then. Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Are you okay?" That question, asked with such genuine concern, such uncomplicated love, almost broke her. Sarah squeezed back once and nodded, not trusting her voice for anything more. 72 hours. That's how long the Pentagon needed to move the machinery of command into motion. 3 hums rolled into the Mercy General ambulance bay at 0900 hours on a Tuesday morning, their arrival accompanied by the precise sound of diesel engines cutting through the urban rhythm of the hospital district. A command vehicle followed, blocking the entrance entirely, and every staff member within sight paused mid-step. Orderlies stopped pushing stretchers. Visitors froze in the lobby. The night shift nurses were already gone, but the day staff gathered near the windows, watching in confusion. This wasn't a patient transfer. This was something else entirely. Something that required military-grade coordination. A Marine Corps captain walked through the lobby doors with the kind of bearing that made the air pressure change, shoulders squared, eyes forward, presence like a tank idling in a garage, all potential force held in absolute control. He approached the front desk with Rodriguez pushing his wheelchair behind him, the older veteran's face set with a determination that seemed to have erased 6 weeks of recovery fatigue. The captain's voice carried across the atrium, clear and official, "I need Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Full rank, last deployment call sign. Pentagon has an urgent matter requiring her immediate briefing." The front desk nurse, a day shift RN named Patricia who'd always been kind to Sarah, went pale. She fumbled for the phone. In that moment, the words hung in the air like a physical object, and they found their target with the precision of a guided missile. Emma was in the main lobby. She'd come to bring her mother's forgotten lunch, the brown paper bag with the thermos of black coffee and the sandwich Sarah always packed the night before. She'd planned to leave it at the desk, make a quick escape before any of the hospital staff made a fuss about her being there. But she heard the captain's voice, and the words Senior Chief Petty Officer, and everything inside her froze. She turned to look at the Marine, then back toward the administrative offices where her mother might be. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, "Senior Chief." The word hung there, suspended, demanding an answer nobody was prepared to give. 2 minutes later, the hospital administrator Voss stood in her office reading from a Pentagon personnel file that had just been transmitted and uploaded to her secure server. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned each page. A nursing supervisor stood nearby, equally shocked. The documents were official, sealed, stamped with classified markings that made Voss's chest tighten. 2 Bronze Stars, she said aloud, her voice hollow. She turned the page, and her breathing hitched. Silver Star. Another page. 2 Purple Hearts. She looked up from the file, as if the words might make more sense if she said them to the air. And a Navy Cross. In the atrium, the SEAL team leader from Virginia Beach stood among the scattered hospital staff, and he began reading the same citations aloud. His voice carried the kind of weight that comes from having served alongside legends. Bronze Star for Valor during Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah, 2004. He paused. Every eye in the hospital was on him. Silver Star for Extraordinary Heroism during Combat Support Operations, Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province, 2008. Another pause. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in direct combat, dates 2007 and 2009. He let that land like a physical thing. And the Navy Cross. The second highest decoration for valor in combat. For actions that saved 14 lives during a complex ambush in the Jolan district, Baghdad, 2007. Dr. Sterling stood in the back of the atrium, watching this unfold, and his face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. The blood left his cheek so completely that for a moment he looked like a medical illustration of shock, pale, hollow, suddenly very small. He'd spent 6 weeks tormenting someone. He'd activated his network, made calls, fabricated documents, and orchestrated her removal from the hospital because her competence threatened the fragile hierarchy he'd constructed around himself. And the person he'd been trying to destroy wasn't just a night shift nurse. She was a senior chief petty officer. She had a Navy Cross. She'd survived Baghdad. The captain turned to find Sarah. Voss, the administrator, directed him down the corridor with a kind of urgency usually reserved for cardiac emergencies. When the captain walked into Sarah's temporary office, the small room where she'd been asked to wait pending investigation, he saluted first. Not because rank demanded it, but because respect did. 2 hours later, after Sarah had been officially released from suspension and reinstated by the hospital's legal team, FBI Special Agents Carmichael and Torres arrived at Mercy General with warrants and quiet authority. They found Dr. Sterling in the physician's lounge, trying to convince himself that everything was still salvageable. Torres displayed his badge, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dr. Sterling, we need to review some digital records with you. Specifically, your access to sealed military personnel files and hospital employment documentation dated 48 hours ago. Sterling's hand started to shake. I was conducting due diligence on. Agent Carmichael interrupted, her voice clipped and efficient. Your login credentials access Senior Chief Chen's classified Pentagon file at 2,347 hours. Then you attempted to modify her hospital employment record. I was documenting insubordination. Torres pulled up the audit trail on a hospital computer. Timestamped entries. Sterling's login. Fabricated disciplinary notes from hospitals where Sarah had never worked. You created false employment history. Federal crime. We're charging you with falsification of official documents and obstruction. Sterling's voice cracked. I didn't know she was military. I thought she was just some night shift nurse who. The SEAL team leader heard this through the open office door. He stepped inside, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the room like a blade. Just some night shift nurse. There's your problem, Doctor. You thought saving lives had a hierarchy. He moved closer, his presence suddenly filling the entire space. The people who work the night shift in this hospital, they're holding lives together while you sleep. While you dream about your promotion. And you tried to destroy one of them because she showed you up in front of residents. The captain's jaw clenched. That's not ambition. That's cowardice. Hospital security arrived. Agent Carmichael read Sterling his rights while Rodriguez watched from his wheelchair, positioned at the perfect angle to see everything. When they placed the handcuffs on Sterling's wrists, his face had become something smaller than before, hollowed out, diminished, the arrogance burned away like fuel that had run dry. They walked him through the lobby, and every staff member present bore witness. A day shift nurse he'd flirted with turned away. A resident he'd mentored found sudden interest in the floor tiles. Rodriguez sat in his wheelchair, immobile but absolutely present, and his voice was steady. True class is what you do when the lights go out, Doctor. You failed that test. The perp walk took 45 seconds. It felt like an hour. Agents loaded Sterling into an unmarked vehicle. Emma watched from inside the glass doors, her lunch bag still clutched in her hands, and she turned to the Marine captain with eyes that were suddenly older. Where's my mom? I need to see my mom right now. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in her new office at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where she trained combat medics as a civilian trauma consultant. The walls held her shadow box for the first time, decorations properly displayed, medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, looking at them no longer something that required hiding. Beside the shadow box hung Rodriguez's faded unit patch, the one he'd sewn into his jacket lining for years and finally shown to Sarah during their late-night conversation. It was framed now with a handwritten note in Rodriguez's careful script, for iron hands, who never forgot what it means to serve. Sarah's daughter Emma sat in on some of the training sessions. She'd watched the video of the Marine captain reading her mother's citations. She'd read the official biography on the Pentagon website. She'd pieced together the nightmares, the way her mom flinched at fireworks, the reason certain sounds made her freeze. But she'd also begun to understand something more important: her mother's refusal to quit on a patient, her willingness to question authority when lives were at stake, her absolute commitment to showing up for the invisible hours. Those weren't side effects of trauma. Those were the signature of someone who'd learned the value of human life in the harshest possible place. Emma's college application essay was about learning that her mother had been a hero long before she knew what the word meant. Dr. Sterling's medical license was permanently revoked. The FBI investigation revealed he'd fabricated records for 3 other staff members over the years, all of them people who'd somehow threatened his authority. He now worked from a folding table in a strip mall outside Raleigh, selling supplemental insurance. His name tag read simply Mark. A former colleague saw him there once and reported that he wouldn't make eye contact. Mercy General overhauled its oversight procedures and hired Sarah as a consultant to develop protocols protecting staff from hierarchical abuse. She trained new hires on recognizing toxic authority and speaking up. During one training session, a young nurse asked, "How did you stay calm when he was tearing you down?" Sarah paused. She remembered the measured breath, the single tear wiped away without breaking eye contact, the steady voice that had told Sterling she'd cleaned up worse messes than he'd ever make. "I learned in Baghdad that people who shout loudest are usually most afraid," she said. "Quiet dignity is a weapon they can't fight. It doesn't give them anything to grab onto." She looked at the faces in front of her, future nurses who might face their own Dr. Sterlings, their own moments where competence threatened fragile egos. Remember this. True class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching, when there's no reward, when it would be easier to walk away, that's when you find out who you really are. The room was silent. Rodriguez's unit patch caught the afternoon light on her desk, a reminder that some bonds of service never break, and that the night shift, the invisible hours when the lights are low and the work is hard, is where real heroes prove themselves. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe to this channel. Hit like. Comment below, what would you have done in Sarah's position? And if you want to see more stories about heroes working in the shadows, the ones nobody sees until the moment it matters most, click that notification bell so you don't miss a single one.